On May 20th, 2012, a Sunday morning dawned over Garland, Texas, a suburb just northeast of Dallas, where people went about their routines, coffee brewing, doors opening, the sense of another ordinary day. Shortly before 7 o'clock a.m., a 76-year-old great-grandmother named Nancy Judith Harris arrived for her morning shift at the Fina Whip Inn convenience store. That same morning, everything changed. Witnesses and surveillance orders later documented a chilling scene. A man entered the store carrying a plastic bottle and lighter, later identified as lighter fluid and a cigarette lighter. He approached Harris from behind, poured the fluid over her head, demanded money, and set her ablaze. She screamed, tried desperately to escape, even to pull off her burning shirt, but the flames engulfed her. A bystander sprayed her with a fire extinguisher, but it was too late. Nancy Harris suffered second through fourth-degree burns over large portions of her body. She was rushed to Parkland Memorial Hospital, where, despite every effort, she died on May 25, 2012, just 5 days after the attack. In her final hours, she managed to give a description of her assailant. Almost exactly 1 hour after the fire began, Matthew Lee Johnson, 36 years old at the time, was arrested nearby. He was found with the stolen rings, cigarettes, lighter, and cash from the register. He confessed on video to police. He said he intended to scare Harris, not kill her, while high on crack cocaine and alcohol. But as he admitted in court, "I hurt an innocent woman. It was not my intention to kill her, but I did." In October 2013, a Dallas jury convicted Johnson of capital murder. The prosecution highlighted the brutality of the attack, the betrayal of trust, and Harris's vulnerability. The defense focused on his history of addiction and childhood abuse, seeking mercy. Still, the jury delivered a death sentence on November 8, 2013, under Texas law. From the day of his conviction, Johnson was housed at the Polunsky Unit in Livingston, Texas's most restricted death row facility. For the next 13 years, he pursued appeals. Every petition was rejected by the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals, the federal courts, and in 2024 by the U.S. Supreme Court. Then came May 20th, 2025, exactly 13 years to the day from Nancy Harris's murder. That morning, guards at the Huntsville unit restrained 49-year-old Johnson on a gurney in the execution chamber holding cell. He was strapped in at 6 o'clock p.m. Central. When asked for final remarks, he paused, then spoke directly to Harris's family, who were seated behind a pane of glass. "I never meant to hurt her. I pray she's the first person I see when I open my eyes, and I will spend eternity with her." At 6:17 p.m., the lethal dose of pentobarbital began. At 6:53 p.m., Texas officials pronounced Johnson dead, the fourth execution in Texas in 2025, and the 595th carried out since 1982. Olivia Harris, Nancy's granddaughter, later said there was no cheers that day, only a painful sense that the calendar's symmetry offered justice. But comfort? That was something only time and forgiveness might eventually bring. This story is not about spectacle. It is about life and death measured in moments, a life stolen, a life ended 13 years later. It is about Nancy Harris, her great-grandchildren's memory, and a system that balanced consequence with calculation. This is 13 years to the day, the execution of Matthew Lee Johnson. Day in Garland, Texas dawned as another ordinary morning, until tragedy struck the Fina Whip Inn convenience store where 76-year-old Nancy Judith Harris worked. At around 7 o'clock a.m., as she began her shift, Surveillance footage shows a man entering the store carrying a bottle of lighter fluid and a lighter. Moments later, he doused Harris with fluid, demanded cash, and set her ablaze during a robbery. Panicked employees and customers attempted to help. A bystander used a fire extinguisher, but Harris, suffering severe burns, collapsed outside the store. Despite emergency treatment, she succumbed to her injuries 5 days later, on May 25, 2012. Dallas County Sheriff's deputies arrested Matthew Lee Johnson, aged 36 at the time, within an hour of the attack. He was found nearby with stolen rings, cigarettes, lighter, cash, and even candy bars. In a recorded statement, Johnson admitted he poured lighter fluid onto Harris, robbed store items, and ignited the fire. Claiming the act was meant to shock her, not kill her, investigators and prosecutors built the case with surveillance footage, the victim's partial description before she died, and Johnson's own confession. He testified during trial that he was under the influence of crack cocaine and alcohol, that he had come to rob the store in order to buy drugs, and that he had made wrong choices, accepting responsibility for his crime, the brutality of the murder, the betrayal of a vulnerable woman doing her job, set in motion a legal process that would last 13 years. Charges of capital murder were filed quickly. Harris's death occurred during robbery and arson, qualifying under Texas law for the most severe penalty. By the fall of 2013, the state of Texas had built its case against Matthew Lee Johnson, charged with capital murder for the death of 76-year-old Nancy Judith Harris during the May 20, 2012 robbery of a Garland convenience store. At trial in Dallas County, prosecutors laid out the evidence. Surveillance video showing Johnson pouring lighter fluid over Harris's head, demanding money, stealing rings, cigarettes, and candy, then calmly walking out as flames engulfed her. Harris later died of burns suffered during the attack. Johnson had been arrested roughly 1 hour later, found with Harris's property in his possession. In a court-executed interview, he admitted setting her ablaze during what he described as a robbery gone wrong. He claimed he was high on crack cocaine and alcohol, stating, "I hurt an innocent woman. It was not my intention to kill her, but I did." The defense did not dispute Johnson's actions. Instead, they focused on mitigation. They highlighted his long history of drug addiction, homelessness since teenage years, and experiences of childhood trauma, with testimony from a psychologist and family members about Johnson's efforts to stay clean. During jury selection, attorneys used Texas's standard death qualification process, ensuring jurors were open to both life without parole and the death penalty. When the trial commenced, the prosecution called forensic experts, fire investigators, and medical examiners. They confirmed Harris died of 2nd through 4th degree burns, not smoke inhalation, and that accelerants at the scene indicated a deliberate fire. Family members provided impactful victim statements. Harris's grandchildren and children expressed horror and grief. One granddaughter stated, "You are not sorry. You are not forgiven." While a son added, "I hope the screams of my mother tear at your soul for eternity." After 2 days of deliberation, the jury returned a guilty verdict on October 30, 2013. Under Texas law, they proceeded immediately to sentencing. All jurors agreed that Johnson posed a continuing threat and that no mitigating factors outweighed the aggravating circumstances. On November 8, 2013, Johnson was sentenced to death by lethal injection. He was then transferred to the Allen B. Polunsky Unit in Livingston, Texas, home to the state's male death row inmates. There, in solitary confinement, his 13-year wait for execution began. For the Harris family and Garland community, the trial verdict offered legal closure, but no emotional peace. The woman they loved had suffered a fate unimaginable, and the system had now given an answer. By early 2024, all state and federal avenues for appeal had been exhausted. The U.S. Supreme Court declined to review Matthew Lee Johnson's case, clearing the path for execution proceedings to proceed. On January 20th, 2025, under Texas procedural law, a Dallas County court formally set Johnson's execution date for May 20th, 2025, exactly 13 years after he carried out the deadly robbery of Nancy Harris. Johnson's legal team filed a clemency petition with the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles prior to the date. They cited his good disciplinary record and raised concerns over how the execution date had been selected. But on May 17, 2025, the board unanimously denied the petition, 7 votes to 0. No reprieve was granted. There would be no surprise intervention from higher courts. Johnson remained in the Huntsville unit, located next door to the state's execution chamber. On May 20, 2025, the fateful day arrived. Johnson, TDCJ 99586, age 49, was escorted to the holding cell adjacent to the death chamber shortly after 6 p.m. Witnesses, including Nancy Harris's family members, observed from behind a glass partition. When offered the chance to make a final statement, Johnson paused and addressed the family directly. "As I look at each one of you, I can see her on that day. I please ask for your forgiveness. I never meant to hurt her." At 6:17 p.m., the lethal dose of pentobarbital was administered. At 6:53 p.m., Johnson was pronounced dead. His execution was the 4th in Texas in 2025 and the 595th since Texas resumed capital punishment in 1982. For the Harris family, the execution brought a form of legal closure, but not necessarily peace. Yet the date remained unforgettable. May 20th, the day Nancy Harris was attacked, and the day justice, in the state's eyes, was carried out. 13 years. One brutal crime. And now, the final chapter. After his arrest on May 20, 2012, in a daylight robbery-turned-arson case, Matthew Lee Johnson was formally charged with capital murder in Dallas County. Under Texas law, murder committed during the commission of another crime, such as robbery or arson, meets the criteria for capital murder. A Dallas County grand jury indicted Johnson later that year. The prosecution declared its intent to pursue the death penalty. During pre-trial proceedings, Johnson remained jailed without bond. His defense team did not dispute his role in the crime. Younger public records confirm he admitted to entering the store, dousing it in lighter fluid, and igniting Nancy Harris. Instead, the defense focused on life circumstances, chronic drug addiction, homelessness, and mental health struggles. Prosecutors countered with the brutal facts. The surveillance footage, the stolen jewelry recovered on Johnson's person, and Harris's videotaped final description of her attacker. They underscored how he targeted and killed a 76-year-old grandmother working alone in her store. In court, jurors were shown graphic evidence, crime scene photos of the burn patterns, fire marshal testimony confirming accelerant use, and autopsy reports verifying that Harris suffered lethal burn injuries, not from smoke inhalation, but from being deliberately set on fire. Johnson's own words, captured on police video, were also introduced. He admitted he placed the lighter fluid and ignited Harris during a robbery gone wrong. After deliberating, the jury reached a unanimous verdict of guilt in October 2013. In the following sentencing phase, they answered 2 questions under Texas law. 1, whether Johnson posed a continuing threat to society, and 2, whether any mitigating factors outweighed the severity of the crime. Finding no reason to spare him, the jury sentenced Johnson to death by lethal injection on November 8, 2013. Johnson was transferred to the Alan B. Polunsky Unit in Livingston, Texas, the state's male death row facility. In a small solitary cell, he would begin a 13-year wait for his fate to be carried out. May 20th, 2025. Exactly 13 years to the day after the horrific murder of 76-year-old Nancy Judith Harris in Garland, Texas. Inside the Huntsville unit, Matthew Lee Johnson, inmate number TDCJ, number 595, age 49, was escorted into the holding area adjacent to the execution chamber. This is the same space where the state has carried out over 500 executions since resuming capital punishment in 1982. Shortly after 6:00 p.m., Johnson was secured to the gurney. Harris's family members were present behind the glass viewing area. When offered a final statement, Johnson turned toward them. "As I look at each one of you, I can see her on that day. I please ask for your forgiveness. I never meant to hurt her. I pray that she's the first person I see when I open my eyes, and I will spend eternity with her. I made wrong choices, I've made wrong decisions, and now I pay the consequences." At 6:17 p.m., a lethal dose of pentobarbital was administered, initiating a lethal injection process that lasted approximately 26 minutes. Johnson gasped and made snoring-like sounds before being pronounced dead at 6:53 p.m. CDT. His execution was the fourth in Texas that year, and one of 18 carried out nationwide in 2025. For Nancy Harris's family, the date offered judicial closure, but not necessarily emotional peace. A brutal crime and equally precise execution marked a full, painful cycle. On May 20th, 2025, the state of Texas carried out the execution of Matthew Lee Johnson at the Huntsville unit, marking the legal end of a case that had stretched over 13 years. But for the family of Nancy Judith Harris, the woman whose life he took, the moment passed without a sense of closure. Nancy Harris had been a 76-year-old grandmother working a Sunday morning shift at the Fina gas station in Garland, Texas, when Johnson entered and set her on fire during a robbery. Surveillance cameras captured the brutal act. She survived for 5 days in a Dallas hospital burn unit before succumbing to her injuries on May 25, 2012. Her death shocked the community, prompting vigils, public tributes, and widespread media attention. Johnson's trial and conviction were relatively swift, but his appeals lasted for years. Over that time, the details of the crime faded from national headlines, even as they remained sharply etched in the memories of those close to Nancy. According to public statements made by her family, they never forgot her warmth, her faith, or her resilience, even in the final days as she fought for her life. When the date of Johnson's execution was finalized in early 2025, it reignited difficult emotions. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals had denied his final appeal. The Board of Pardons and Paroles, after considering a clemency petition, voted unanimously 7-2 to reject it. In the days leading up to the execution, members of Nancy's family released statements through the media, saying they had waited more than a decade for justice to be served. On the evening of May 20th, they sat behind the glass in Huntsville's death chamber. Johnson did not offer a final statement. At 6:17 p.m., a single lethal dose of pentobarbital was administered. At 6:34 p.m., he was declared dead. He became the third person executed in Texas in 2025, and the 586th since the state resumed executions in 1982. But for Nancy's loved ones, it wasn't a moment of victory. Her son, as reported by local NBC coverage, said simply, "There's no joy in it. She's not coming back." In Garland, reminders of the case still linger. The gas station where the crime occurred has since changed ownership. The neighborhood has moved on, but people still recall the early morning fire, the first responders' efforts to save Nancy, and the horror of learning that someone had doused a woman in lighter fluid and set her ablaze over a few stolen dollars. Johnson's execution marked the end of a long legal chapter, but it also reopened old wounds. His clemency application cited childhood abuse, drug addiction, and remorse. But to the public, it was his actions, captured on camera, admitted in court, and reaffirmed by forensic evidence, that defined his legacy. Legal justice had been rendered. The sentence carried out. But emotional justice, of the kind that brings peace to grieving families, is far more elusive. 13 years had passed. One act of senseless violence had taken 2 lives in different ways, one through physical destruction, the other through spiritual descent. A woman who had raised children and worked into her 70s, a man who, by his own admission, traded her life for cash and tried to erase the evidence with fire. This was not a case of mistaken identity. It was not a trial plagued by uncertainty. It was, as the courts ruled over and over, a clear-cut act of capital murder. But even so, for those who remember Nancy Harris, justice was never about revenge. It was about recognition, about dignity, about ensuring that the final chapter of her life was not defined by the cruelty of her death, but by the strength of her legacy. This was not merely the end of a criminal case. It was the closing of a tragedy. And so, with the date etched forever in memory, May 20th, the calendar tells its own version of the story. One woman, one crime, 13 years of waiting. This was, years to the day, the execution of Matthew Lee Johnson.